We keep looking at different types of cardiovascular exercise. And we sometimes wonder, are there differences that we can get? Are there benefits that we can get from the different zones that we might see in terms of cardio? And is the focusing on zone two just hype? Well, let's talk about that.
Warning! The following presentation contains information that might contradict what you have previously heard, or believed to be true, about how the human body works, and contains material that is not suitable for closed-minded individuals. Enjoy!
So, when we start looking at this exercise idea, first thing we have to kind of address is what does it mean to be a cardio exercise? Is it simply going out and running outside? Is it going on the treadmill and running on the treadmill? Or is it doing things like weightlifting, doing body compositional exercises, doing body weight exercises, doing calisthenics? Are all of those different types of cardiovascular exercise? When we're talking about cardiovascular exercise, we're simply talking about any type of exercise that's going to cause any type of changes in heart functions, that's going to cause changes in the rate at which the heart is contracting, where blood is going throughout the body. In this case here, any type of exercise is going to be a cardiovascular exercise. The way in which you look at the idea about exercise is based off of changes that we see within the heart, particularly within heart rate. When we start looking at this idea about cardiovascular exercise, in particular the cardiovascular zones, what we're really talking about is this idea about heart rate reserve. What we're talking about in heart rate reserve is we're talking about what is the range that we want our heart rate to be relative to the age predicted or actual maximal heart rate that we can have relative to our non-exertional heart rate, which some people reference as our resting heart rate, even though resting and maximal heart rates are something that we actually get through actual clinical observations. The heart rate reserve is the percentage that we want to be working at in order to have these distinct, put quotes around that, cardiovascular benefits from exercise. And so if we look at this, the idea about, say, like working at a 70% heart rate reserve is going to be our non exertional heart rate, say 60 beats per minute. And then 70% of the difference between our age predicted and our non exertional heart rate. And so if we have an age predicted heart rate of, say, 180 and a non exertional heart rate of 60, our 70% of that is going to be about 84. And so our 70% of heart reserve range is going to be around 144 beats per minute. That is the heart rate that we want to work at if we're going to work at a 70% of our heart rate reserve. It's not necessarily saying we're working at 70% of our maximum heart rate. We're simply working at a. And so all of these changes that we see in terms of cardiovascular benefit, in terms of exercise benefits, based off of a few key ideas here in terms of variable responses. First is looking at the optimization of the energy systems that are being used. The other way we're looking at it is based off of which zone is going to maximize our fat burning capacities. We will also look at the idea about the different types of training intensities in terms of how we go about utilizing the different types of training intensities in terms of exercise benefits that can come about. But all of the ideas that we have, particularly when we start looking at this idea about zone two and the benefits we get from zone two, and what most people think about when they start thinking about what benefits we're going to get from exercise is the fat utilization that we have within exercise intensities and how hard can we work before we start to lose the fat burning abilities within exercise. All of those things are based off of four distinct characteristics that all exercise is going to provide. This is where we can start thinking about all exercises as being cardiovascular in benefit. The assumptions that we're going to have is we're going to have a change in the energy demand. We're going to start having changes in the quote unquote calorie burning that we might have. And we start talking about calorie burning. This is where we have this idea that we've talked about previously, where it's the misconception about what we're doing in terms of energy utilization here. When we're talking about energy demand, we're talking about how much ATP is necessary in order to do what we're doing at the intensity that we're doing it. The duration of exercise is how long am I doing that effort in a sustained manner? Not necessarily how long am I doing exercise in total. There are two distinct factors that we're going to look at when we start looking at this idea about the cardio zones. and that idea about duration and energy demand. The idea about energy demand and the idea about duration is going to lead into that third idea, the metabolic pathways in the fuel utilization. And this is where we're going to have to look at the different types of energy pathways that we use in order to get ATP back to the body so we can keep doing what we need to do. This is where we're going to have our phosphagen pathways, our ATP CP cycling taking place, our AMPK pathways coming into play, as well as our glycolysis, and then eventually into our aerobic pathways. In this, we're going to be utilizing different types of fuels, regardless of whether or not we're trying to maximize, but quotes around that, the fat utilization in our exercise, where we will always be utilizing all the various types of fuels and all the various types of metabolic pathways. The last part of this is where we start seeing this idea about all exercise being cardiovascular. And that's because all exercise is going to put a stress on the heart and stress on the cardiorespiratory pathways, in particular the cardiovascular pathways, that's going to lead to cardiac drifts and cardiac shifts. That's changes in the heart rate based off of changes in where blood is going. In this, we start looking at, in terms of particularly the cardiovascular zones, as to how much cardiac drifting takes place due to how much cardiac shifting takes place. The degree of cardiac drift and the degree of cardiac shift is going to be based off of changes to the first 3 points that we look at in terms of the assumption of exercise benefits. This is where we're going to have our distinct zones. The first zone that we look at is the very light zone. This very light zone is what we have in terms of everyday normal activity. This zone is usually referenced as being between 50 and 60% of the heart rate reserve. We will see improved fatty acid oxidation, use of lipids within the energy pathways in this zone. And that's because the need for ATP is very low. Whenever the need for ATP is very low, we're going to have high amounts of fats being used as a fuel source. Because the intensity is excessively low, we will see very limited amounts of changes to our capacities. We will see very low changes in cardiorespiratory capacity changes. We will see very low changes in aerobic capacity changes. The next zone is the light zone, and this is what's usually referenced as zone 2. Zone 2 is going to take me up to about 70% of my heart rate reserve. This is where, if we look at the literature, where we're going to start seeing maximum amounts of fatty acid oxidation for the exercise zones. We usually don't look at zone 1 as being an exercise zone. Just like with zone 1, we see very limited amounts of changes to our capacities. And that's because we don't have high amounts of ischemia taking place, high amounts of metabolic demand taking place, which means that we're not going to get changes in how many mitochondria we're going to get, or changes in the amount of aerobic capacity improvements we're going to get. If we look at the literature in terms of benefits, long-term benefits, the very light and light zones, the zone 1, zone 2, tend to be associated with that steps per day associated relative reduction in risk for non-communicable diseases. But it doesn't come with a large amount of changes in our actual functional performance capacity changes. We start seeing functional capacity changes when we start getting into our moderate area. Our moderate area is our 70 to 80% of our heart reserve. This is where we start looking at the charts on the machines in the gym, and we start seeing it go from the fat burning areas into the cardio areas. That 70 to 80% of heart reserve is where we're going to start seeing improved cardiodynamic shifts. We're going to start seeing improvements in the vasculature. We're going to start seeing improvements in blood pressures. We're going to start seeing improvements in the heart. We're going to start seeing changes in the anatomy of the heart that's going to match the changes in the physiology of the heart. We're going to start seeing improvements in our maximal capacities, what we usually reference as VO2 max. That is, how much oxygen can I maximally use per minute per kilogram of body mass. But the other thing I'm going to start seeing is I'm going to start seeing an improvement in my aerobic capacities. I'm going to start having cellular changes taking place within the muscles, within the tissues of the body, that's going to cause more mitochondria to come about. That improvement in mitochondria is going to make me a better, more efficient fuel utilizer. It's going to allow me to have improvements in my endurance that I don't see when I'm looking at my light and my very light levels of cardiovascular zones. The next zone is the hard zone. The hard zone is where we're creeping towards our maximal capacities. This is where I'm going to be at 80 to 90% of my heart reserve. This is where I'm going to start to have early onset of fatigue. I can get fatiguing quickly within the zone 3. However, when I'm in zone 4, I'm going to start seeing fatigue set in within a few minutes. That set of fatiguing is going to lead to increasing my VO2 max more than what I saw with the moderate zone. It's going to see an improvement in my aerobic capacity more than in my moderate zone. I'm going to see better improvements in my cardiovascular functions, both anatomically as well as physiologically, working in this hard zone. The problem is that I'm going to have increased amounts of rest and recovery, utilizing the hard zone relative to the moderate zone. The maximal zone is where I'm going beyond 90% of my heart reserve. I'm at my maximal capacity. That increase in maximal capacity is going to lead to improvements in anaerobic capacity. While I'm looking at my light, my moderate, and my hard zones as increasing the amount of lactate in the blood and working me towards my lactate acid thresholds within the blood, it's not necessarily going to lead to overall improvements in anaerobic capacities relative to my aerobic capacities. In this maximum zone, not only am I going to improve my aerobic capacities by improving the amount of mitochondria that I have available to me, by increasing the amount of red blood cells that I have to move gases around the body, by increasing the amount of blood that I have in order to help me with thermal regulation, as well as moving stuff around the body within the blood vessels. I'm also going to get signals that are going to make me want to have more blood vessels. That signal to make more blood vessels is going to start kicking in that moderate band of exercise. And so when I'm working at my maximum, not only am I going to improve my aerobic capacity, my VO2 max, but I'm also going to improve my anaerobic capacity. That is, how hard can I work in very short durations? What kind of power output can I produce? What kind of strength output can I produce? All those things are going to improve when I'm in my maximal cardiovascular zone relative to any of the other zones that's there. Within this, we start seeing very types of trendy exercises come into play. And this is where we have to start looking at the hypes that we get as it relates to the different types of exercise that we have. Where we used to start thinking about this exercise stuff as long and slow in terms of our exercise durations. This is where we get this steady state ideas coming into our cardiovascular or endurance training. That may or may not be the best benefit for us. From that, we started getting into ideas about intervals and circuit trainings, where we're going to have variable levels of intensity for shorter durations, but still have a longer duration type of exercise. This is where we start getting into the ideas about the HIIT training, the high intensity interval training, or the CrossFit training, where we're going to have higher level intensity stuff going on for very short durations in time, but having multiple types of intensities coming into play. Recently, we've come back to doing this long and slow idea, doing a lot of things where we're doing high incline treadmill walking at very low speeds for long periods of time relative to the other duration exercises. And so when we start looking at this idea, the idea we have to think about is, okay, why is zone 2 all the range? Why is it we're hearing all these things about zone 2? The improved cardiovascular fitness, the enhanced fat burning, the increased endurance, the faster recovery, the improved mental health, the reduced risk of injury, the reduced metabolic disease, the improvement in type 2 diabetic conditions. Those are the things that everybody hypes about when it comes to this zone 2. But the problem is that zone 2 can be no better than the other zones. And it has to deal with all of the ideas that we look at in terms of the quantification and qualification of exercise. And the idea that we need to have the correct amount of exercise for the correct amount of time at the correct amount of intensity. where we're going to be able to stress the body enough in order to get the correct said adaptations, specific adaptations to impose demands, to allow for not only improvement in health outcome, but also improvements in performance. And this is where, if we look at some of the ideas as it relates to training intensities and the need to have a Goldilocks zone, we're missing the connection point here. We're not trying to get a Goldilocks zone, we're trying to get a baby bear response, where we're trying to make sure that everything is just right. But we're trying to make sure that everything is just right outside of exercise. We have to have a stress here. We have to have a stress that's going to cause an adaptational response. A response is going to cause the body to have to reestablish what is just right. And that comes about not through establishing a Goldilocks response, but establishing a Three Little Pigs response, where we're going to stress the straw hut and attempt to build the twig hut. And then we're going to stress the twig hut in an attempt to build the brick house. What we're trying to do is we're trying to make the body more resistant, more resilient to the stresses that we place on it, so that we're able to get the greatest amount of benefit that we can get for the exercise that we're doing, at the intensities that we're doing it, for the duration that we're doing it. And it goes back to something we talked about previously, and something we'll touch on at the very end of this, about periodization and the need to have variable responses and variable intensities of training. If we look at what Langen basically gave us in terms of the idea about this moderate intensity continuous training versus the interval training ideas, where we're looking at the biggest difference coming about relative to the continuous training versus the interval training being changes in body composition, in particular body fat, changes in body composition, in particular types of muscle fiber changes, and changes in mitochondrial efficiency as well as mitochondrial amounts. The problem with this is that it's discounting the other forms of exercise that we've talked about previously, that we've written on previously, as it relates to the fitness and fatness continuum, and in terms of the greatest amount of efficacy that we have in terms of exercise for improving body composition and improving health outcome, not coming from the endurance training stuff, not coming from this continuous cardio idea or this interval cardio idea, but coming about from the inclusion of resistance training within the exercises that are used for improving body composition and reducing risk for metabolic diseases. While we will see changes in between the sprint training and the continuous training, or the interval training and the continuous training, there are other researchers out there that have indicated that the interval training can be just as efficient in terms of that mitochondrial side of the aspect as the continuous training. And the ischemic changes that we might see from exercise leading to changes in both changes of amount of vascular changes as well as changes in mitochondrial changes, leading to improvements in aerobic capacity. Whereas the changes that we see on the energetic side, that we're going to see the greatest amount of cardiovascular or aerobic capacity benefits coming from exercise. Whereas the muscle contraction side is going to lead to changes within the type of muscle fibers that we're going to get. And the fact that we want to have adaptations across the continuum of muscle fibers, as well as an adaptation across the continuum of energetic pathways, that's going to make me a more efficient body, that's going to reduce my relative risk for injury, that's going to make me have a greater level of capacity, not just allow me to lose weight, but also see overall improvements in health. The whole idea here in terms of this cardiovascular benefit is, can we improve our aerobic capacity? Can we improve the cardiovascular functions? And it boils down to what type of mitochondrial biogenesis, what type of hormonal responses am I seeing as relates to, am I going to become a better, more efficient fuel utilizer, not just during exercise, but during the rest of the day. And that's where I'm going to start seeing my overall improvements in health coming away from my exercise, which leads to the next question. How can I maximize the benefits of cardio from exercise? And once again, it goes back to this idea of, am I going to get it maximally from running on the treadmill? Am I getting it maximally from going outside and running? Or can I get the same benefits from doing body weight calisthenic exercises or from weightlifting? Do I see benefits coming away from them? And it goes back to, what am I asking of the cardiovascular system to do relative to moving blood around the body? Am I asking for the heart to have to do anatomical and physiological changes? Am I asking for the blood vessels to do anatomical and physiological changes within the exercise? And this is where we start looking at, what does the literature tell us about anatomical and physiological changes to training? When I train, I get a larger heart. I get greater volume of the heart, particularly within the ventricles, following training, regardless of whether it's strength training or endurance training. As long as I am not at full maximal capacity throughout the entirety of my training events, I will get larger chamber volumes. I will get greater contraction strengths. I will get a reduced risk for fibrosis and dysfunction within the muscles of the heart, which is going to make the heart a more efficient pump. This is where we have to remember what is the actual anatomical function of the heart, is that it's to function as a hydraulic pump. It's to move a non-compressible fluid, blood, around the body so the blood can do what the blood needs to do. Along with these changes in the heart, we're going to see more blood. As we train, the amount of blood that we have is going to increase. The amount of blood cells that we have is going to increase. The amount of all the stuff that we have in the blood is going to increase. That increase in blood, the increase in the volume that the heart is able to move within each contraction, leads to a improvement of what's called compliance of the blood vessels. That means the blood vessels are able to expand and return back to normal shape better than they could prior to exercise. And this doesn't matter what level of exercise we are doing. It doesn't matter whether we are at our very light or at our maximal. We will see an improvement in compliance of the blood vessels. There is some kind of disagreement within the literature as to which level of exercise is going to provide the maximum amount of benefit in terms of that compliance, or whether we're going to get compliance changes from resistance training, same as we get compliance training from endurance training, where you get the same type of compliance changes that we see in weight training relative to the same type of changes that we see in cardio, of course, around that training. And the disagreement shows us that we have this continuum of responses where all types of exercise, the post-training responses is going to have an improvement in blood vessel compliance, which is going to reduce blood pressures. Reduced blood pressures, greater volume of the ventricles, better compliance of the blood vessels with each contraction, based off of a principle of physiology within the heart known as the Frank Starling principle, is going to lead to a better overall function of the heart. The heart becomes better. The heart becomes better when we have these training adaptations taking place. And once again, it doesn't matter whether we're in zone 1 or zone 2 or zone 3 or zone 4 or zone 5 within these training adaptation responses. All of them will lead to a better overall heart function. We will get a lower rate of changes in terms of heart functions at the lighter end of the cardio zones relative to the hard and moderate levels of zones. When we get up to that maximum zone, we have to worry about a secondary issue coming into play that has to deal with the amount of peripheral resistance on the blood vessels due to muscle contraction resisting blood flow, that based off of how we go about setting up our training may have a negative impact on the heart. But that's something we'll talk about at a later time. So what does this mean about the hype around zone 2? Is zone 2 worth the hype? Is it worth spending all of our time doing it? The problem with zone 2 is the hyper focus here is on exercise strictly being about fat burning during exercise, strictly being about weight loss during exercise, and not about changes in performance. We have to remember is that exercise is going to lead to improved fitness regardless of the cardio zone, based off of what we talked about in terms of the fitness and fatness continuum relative to the risk for disease and the balance point that we see where we start having increasing amounts of activity regardless of the amount of body fat we might have. And all this stems from changes within the upstream and downstream regulatory elements, the interplay between the regulatory elements within the body that's going to lead to improved cellular responses, improved tissue responses, improved system responses. That's going to improve and increase my metabolic flexibilities. That's going to improve my sensitivity to hormones like leptin and insulin, which we usually talk about in terms of the diabetic conditions. That's going to improve my utilization of fatty acids within metabolic pathways. It's going to improve my fat-free mass. It's going to increase the amount of muscle and bone that I have. That's going to change the type of adipose tissue that I have. That's going to improve my cardiovascular functions by improving my compliance within the blood vessels, by increasing the amount of blood vessels that I have. That's going to reduce the total amount of inflammation that's there. And that's one of the key things that we haven't touched on in any of these cardio zones is how does the exercise itself improve inflammation responses? And this is where we have to go back and look at and think about. All exercise is going to have a reduction in inflammation responses by changing relative levels of inflammatory signals relative to the number of growth signals that I have. It's also going to help me reduce the amount of stress that I have. And it's going to help normalize my stress responses, which is going to help with my mental health, which is going to help with my cognitive functions by allowing me to have a normal level of stress response taking place at all times. The other thing we have to remember is that we have to look at long duration exercise as being the key here. And focusing on a specific zone may not meet my self-selected form of exercise. And if it doesn't meet my self-selected form of exercise, I'm not going to do it without having a sense of coercion there. I'm not going to do it without having somebody there drill sergeanting me to have to do the exercise. So what can we say about this idea? Does it matter whether I'm in my zone 1, zone 2, or up in my zone 3, zone 4, zone 5, as it relates to the cardio zone and the benefits I can get from exercise? Well, we have to think about in terms of the fit idea, the frequency of training. How often am I able to do the exercise? The intensity of training. How hard am I working out? The time that I'm training. How long am I doing the exercise? And then the type of exercise that I'm doing. In this idea about fit, we have to also think about the idea about periodization, where we have to remember that any change in our diet, any change in our exercise has the potential to lead to improved health, but only if we allow for a continuous set of changes to take place. Does it fit into my mesocycle? Does it fit into my macro cycle? Does it allow me to get the benefits that I want to get from exercise? Does it give me the encouragement? Does it give me the physiological changes that I'm seeking based on the said principle? Is it allowing me to get the maximum amount of benefit that I can get from the exercises that are there? And this is where we have to remember we're going to have to work across all of the zones of cardiovascular changes in order to get the maximum benefit that we can get from exercise and ensure long-term changes based off of the periodization that we have. Well, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Hopefully, got a little bit out of the conversation as relates to the cardiovascular zones and whether zone 2 is worth the hype. Please make sure that you are liking. Please make sure you are subscribing. Please make sure you're sharing out with all your friends and family. Give us that big 5-star rating. Give us that big thumbs up. Let us know that we're doing a good job here. Go ahead and click that bell. Get alerts to new stuff that we're putting out. Make sure to follow us on all the various platforms here on YouTube, as well as the podcast, the written stuff in Substack, as well as the quick takes that we post to Instagram and to Threads.